Good morning. Welcome to the Ohio LTAP Center's webinar on creating a rural active transportation plan, which is a new course that's part of our Active Transportation Academy. This is Victoria Beal with the Ohio LTAP Center, and I have with me as your presenter today Amelia Mansfield, who is with Burton Planning. Amelia, I do have you unmuted, so when we get to that point, you'll be able to go ahead and take the reins and run with it. I do want to just go over a couple of housekeeping items, though, before I turn things over to Amelia. We are taking questions this morning through the chat pod, and hopefully you see that on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. If you don't, please look for the circle with the thought bubble in it and click on it in order to display the chat pod. Please feel free to put questions in the chat pod, and I will read those off to Amelia during the presentation for a response. We definitely encourage questions because this is a topic that I know is going to be near and dear to a lot of people's hearts. As you know, active transportation in the rural areas, being a resident of a rural area, I know it can be a much more of a challenge than an urban area where you have a built environment. Rural areas present more of a challenge for being active, either walking or biking. So I am really pleased that Amelia is going to be presenting an overview of the course that you can actually host at your facility. So Amelia, are you ready to go? Oh, we're not hearing her yet. Maybe she's got herself muted. Well, while she's figuring that part of it out,
can you hear me now?
Oh, I can definitely hear you now.
Okay.
I did forget to tell everybody that we are attempting to record the webinar. If we're successful, we will send a link out to everyone. But if we're not, it's great that you're here and are be able to view this live and in person. So again, please put your questions in the chat pod for Amelia, and I'm going to go ahead and let her take things and run with them now.
Thank you, Victoria. All right, so today we are going to take a look at what the Creating a Rural Active Transportation Plan course has in store if you wish to host it in your community, and we hope that you do. So as Victoria so graciously introduced me, here's a recap of that. My name is Amelia. I am a planning manager at Burton Planning Services. And for the Active Transportation Academy, my roles specifically are to serve as the consultant project manager. I also develop courses such as the Rural Active Transportation Planning course, and I am a course instructor. There are other course developers and instructors as well, just one of a team of mighty folks helping to spread the good word about active transportation throughout Ohio. So today's agenda is to first give you an overview of the Active Transportation Academy itself, to refresh your memory or to fill you in if this is your first exposure to it. Then we will talk about the course goals and learning outcomes for the actual Rural Active Transportation Plan course. We will go through some highlighted topics, and it's important to remind you that these courses are typically 4 hours long, and since I'll only be sharing with you for about 40 minutes, you can imagine that this is quite abbreviated, and it isn't meant to teach you necessarily. It's more meant to show you exactly what we would be covering when we brought the course to your community. And so hopefully it entices you and you want to hear the full 4-hour selection of information. And then we'll let you know how to actually apply to host the training. The Active Transportation Academy's purpose is to offer trainings to help communities reach your active transportation goals throughout Ohio. So these trainings are free, and any local jurisdiction is welcome to apply to host them. You can partner with other local jurisdictions as well. Just as long as you're a school, a health department, a government entity, we're pretty open to how you define yourself being a local jurisdiction. We just want to make sure that all of those particular players are involved and able to make sure that the people who are building the infrastructure and who are actually implementing policies and programs for active transportation are participating in the course. We do offer professional development credits for attendees. One of the most enticing ones is the AICP credits. We also provide a certificate of completion so that if you do self-reporting for whatever your accreditation is, you have that documentation to submit. If you want more information, you'll be able to click on that green text when Victoria makes the presentation available, but otherwise you can Google ODOT and navigate to the LTAP section and then to the Active Transportation Academy page. We have a lot of courses in the Active Transportation Academy. I think it's upwards of 16 now. We have 4 new courses, the first being the one that we're here to talk about today. But then we also recently launched the Creating a Vision Zero Action Plan course, as well as the Mobility Solutions, Transit's First and Last Mile course. And then brand new is we are starting to offer some of the courses in an on-demand e-learning format where you log into ODOT's online training system and you're able to complete a course that way and still get your transcript so that you can use it to show that you completed the materials. And so the one that we have available now is the Adult School Crossing Guard training, and we encourage you to take a look at that. We have some basic training courses. These tend to be really popular. We have the Advocating for Active Transportation, which talks about how to build advocacy within your community to get local decision makers and the different implementers on board with active transportation projects and integrating them into your community. We also have the Community Traffic Calming Programs course, which is pretty self-explanatory. We get into some specific countermeasures for traffic calming, which tends to be pretty interesting for engineers and people who are design focused. We have Complete Streets Implementation, which takes everything to the next level and helps you walk away with an outline of how you're going to implement Complete Streets work in your community. We have a hands-on conducting walk and bike audits course, which actually includes a mock walk audit, which is pretty fun, where we get out on the street in your community and practice how to lead a walk or bike audit so that you can then replicate that for your own projects. And then health and equity in transportation, which is a really popular and important subject nationwide right now, making sure that we draw the connections between health and how transportation affects it and how it affects transportation, and then equity playing into that significantly. Our Train the Trainer courses are listed here, and these are typically hosted or participated in by school districts and school-related volunteers. We do have planners and engineers and local decision makers and other advocates participating as well. These are originally to help build up the Safe Routes to School efforts, and they continue to be widely used. So we have some other Safe Routes to School training and implementation courses as well, and so they're listed here. I'm not going to read them ad nauseum here, but the Safe Routes to School lesson plans course is a longer one, and it is intended to be used for educators in the school districts. So coming soon, I had mentioned the online on-demand training. We're going to be launching Advocating for Active Transportation and Community Traffic Calming programs in that on-demand e-learning format as well here in the near future, so stay tuned for that as well. So now to get into the meat of today's presentation. So you're all here tuned in wanting to know what the Creating a Rural Active Transportation Plan course is going to be like. What kind of contents is it going to include? What will you walk away with once you've participated in it? So the main goals and learning outcomes of this are to learn about opportunities and challenges of rural active transportation implementation. So we've heard from all of you that there are specific challenges regarding active transportation in your rural communities with specific populations, with the landscape, with surrounding land use. And there are other opportunities as well that don't exist in other types of areas. And so we want to make sure that we cover that so that we understand why we are actually taking the course. We want to be familiar with rural active transportation best practices, so we take a look at best practices both in Ohio and across the nation to learn from people's experiences. And then we want to be familiar with funding and resources available for implementing your rural active transportation programs. So when we host this training in your community, it's going to be broken up into several parts. The first part is the introduction to rural active transportation. And so, as I just mentioned, we're going to spend time talking about rural active transportation challenges and opportunities, and we're actually going to talk about the disparities between rural versus urban areas. And so knowing that a lot of times the feeling is that the focus is on urban areas, and acknowledging that there are specific disparities in rural areas that are quite different than urban areas, but there are some similarities as well, and what can we do to learn from one another and to partner, especially as the urban transcends into the suburban, into the rural, and there are interactions between those. So we'll talk about, why rural active transportation in general? Why are we being specific? And so we get into all of the different particularities. And so, for example, a few of them here are that there are long distances between services. So as opposed to a more densely developed area where you can easily get to medical appointments, grocery stores, schools, etc., the distances are typically longer in rural communities. There are health disparities that the Ohio Department of Health and different national health organizations have done research on, showing that there are specific health disparities in rural communities as opposed to other types of communities. And we get into what those are and how some of them are directly related to inactivity and other environmental factors. And so how can active transportation help to minimize those health disparities? There are higher crash rates on certain types of rural infrastructure, and so we'll look at that and specifically talk about the bicyclists and pedestrians and other non-motorized vehicles and how they are susceptible to serious and fatal types of crashes. And then looking at income disparities, rural communities are shown to be less affluent, and so how does that play into the accessibility of your own vehicle in your household? How does that play into the ability to actually from a jurisdictional level pay for infrastructure improvements? And so we'll take a look at that as well. The rural versus urban disparities that we'll be looking at are listed here, but again, I've mentioned a few of these already. We'll get into a lot of details on this. So taking a look at safety in rural communities versus urban communities, safety both from the perceived and personal safety with crime and whatnot, but also with safety of the road network. Take a look at the different funding constraints and opportunities that exist in rural areas, but not in urban, and vice versa. We'll take a look at health and income, as I had mentioned before. We'll also take a look at development patterns, which are really the defining aspect of what makes a rural community. And so understanding that accessibility to active transportation infrastructure and even people wanting to use active transportation infrastructure really does play into how the development is patterned in their community. We'll take a look at physical barriers. So this includes things like large tracts of farmland that would be a hardship to put a sidewalk through, or environmental factors such as a large river or a stand of forest or whatnot. And then unique users. So one example of this that ODOT has heard a lot of is the Amish community, which we know is prevalent in parts of Ohio. And so how do we address their specific needs and understand that it is a rural disparity versus an urban situation? So again, here with the Amish and the unique users, we also take a look at differently abled population, and so understanding that in an area that is less densely populated, longer distances between where people need to go, maybe a lack of pedestrian infrastructure such as sidewalks, how do people who are using wheelchairs navigate? And then agricultural equipment, so it's slow moving, it's wide. How do we make sure that those types of unique users can participate in the roadway network, but at the same time coexist with people who are walking and biking? And then livestock also maybe seems funny, but this is a concern. So how do we address planning for active transportation and also understanding that there might be some unique barriers as well that aren't always present? So after we've understood, why are we talking about active transportation in a rural context, we then go into determining what your existing conditions are in your rural community for active transportation. So we take a look at socioeconomics, geography, the transportation system, and then again, land use. So when we look at socioeconomic data, we're going to be looking at things like income, population demographics, everything from age to race to income again, and then health. And so as I've mentioned before, all of these do have their own particularities in rural communities, and we want to talk about why that is and how does that play into the way people get around. We'll also take a look at data sources regarding the natural environment conditions, and so something as simple as, is your community rural, or excuse me, is it flat or is it hilly? And how does that impact people's ability to walk and bike and use mobility aids to get around their community as opposed to using a vehicle? We'll take a look at the transportation system. So there are some specific challenges that can come to play in rural communities. And this is not just expansive agricultural land that we're talking about. We're also talking about the small town centers that are located in rural communities. So oftentimes there's narrow right-of-way to work with. So how do we engineer sidewalks and multi-use paths and bike lanes and different types of active transportation infrastructure? How do we factor in the higher speed limits that are typically seen in rural communities, even where there is a cluster of residential properties or a school, for example? Oftentimes in rural communities, we have the lack of a hard shoulder. So where that additional right-of-way might exist, it's not practical to actually build on it. We take a look at conditions of the roads. Are they paved? Are they maintained? And then again, talking about the specific situation in rural communities of a highway that has high posted speeds serving as a main street where there's a lot of activity and people wanting to move about, but is there a safe way to do it? There's the 40-mile-per-hour speed limit sign in this little residential area. So we also want to look at different transportation system characteristics. So we'll be taking a look at speed, the number of lanes, again, the presence of or lack of right-of-way and how wide that is, different safety data, so crashes, the factors that contribute to the crashes, taking a look at the existence or lack of bike and pedestrian facilities, and then looking at active transportation trip generators. So where are the places that people are coming and going to, and want to come and go to on foot or on bike or with a mobility aid? We'll specifically get into actual data sources so that when you're finished with the training, you're able to go back to wherever you like to do your work and take a look at the data for your community. We'll go into ODOT's TIMS system and demonstrate how to collect some information for your specific community, and that way you feel a little bit more comfortable doing that in your own day-to-day work. Again, we'll use TIMS to take a look at what the crash situation is in your community. We'll also take a look at the GIS crash analysis tool, or GCAT, which you might be familiar with already, and we'll walk you through how to actually make a crash report for your community. We will take a look at all of these specific elements of your bicycle and pedestrian network, or lack thereof. So we want to be able to understand where people currently are able to walk and bike safely versus where there might be some gaps in the network, or where there might be a need for these types of facilities, but they aren't currently there. The active transportation trip generators, here's a list of what they might be, but we'll talk about in your community specifically, what are the trip generators. That way you're starting to think about, okay, you know, maybe I have a large community and I can't figure out where to start with this. Let's take a look at where the trip generators are, and let's collect the data that we just went through, and let's see where people are able to currently get around safely with biking and walking versus where they're not, and then maybe that's a way for us to prioritize where we start our work. So what we'll do as an activity in this training is break you up into small groups, and the instructor will give you a map, which is going to be for your community, or a community that's represented by someone in your training. And we're going to display different types of data that we just discussed, and we'll take a look at it online when available, and also look at it on the map. And then you're going to work together as a group to mark up where your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats are in the parameters of that map within your community regarding active transportation. That way you can start to understand where the good things are, where the things that need attention are located, and then again, that'll help to prioritize how you move forward. A real big goal of the Active Transportation Academy is to make sure that the trainings are specifically relevant to your community, and that you can walk away with something tangible, not just the important information in your mind. And so we really aim to make sure that these activities are customized. And so we'll be working with the ODOT team to make sure that these maps and the data that we use in the training are up to date and relevant for you. So the third part of the training is talking about active transportation facilities specifically, and so this gets into that design and engineering component, and taking a look at these 4 different types of facilities or users that we're trying to accommodate. And so what we'll do is we'll actually go through each of those 4 categories in detail, and so here's an example of what it would be like. So if we're talking about mixed traffic facilities, here are the list of what they might be, and then we will go into describing them in detail. So one of those mixed traffic facilities is a bicycle boulevard. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to be relevant to every one of your communities, but we're going to give you the information so that you can have a toolbox, if you will, of different types of facilities that might be appropriate, and we'll work together during the training to help to identify which ones might be best for your community. So when we're talking about bicycle boulevards, we're going to show you, where they would be best used. So for example, here in a low-speed, medium volume area, we explain what it is. So cyclists use the full roadway, pedestrians are still separated onto a sidewalk or a path, and there are sharrows on the street, and then our signage as well. And then, here's an example of, we put this in your village center or on a connecting road that accesses a bike path, which tend to run through rural communities. Then we'll show you what they look like. And so here, actually, this is the wrong image. I apologize for that, but we would show you a picture of what the bicycle boulevard would be like in this FHWA format. That way, if you're familiar already with accessing FHWA information, you again, are familiar with the way that they design their renderings, and you can use this in your own presentations and deliverables. So then we would get into visually separated facilities, and so here are the examples: a paved shoulder, a bike lane, or a pedestrian lane. And Also, during these trainings, if we have images for your specific community, we'll make sure to put them into the presentation so that the people that are participating can identify with the material. So again, a visually separated paved shoulder, we would go through where it would be applicable to use it. In this case, in a higher speed, higher volume area. We would explain what it is. So it's a shoulder that's paved or widened to accommodate cyclists outside of those main traffic lanes. And then here we're talking about specifically how it might be preferable for Amish users. And then we give you an example along a rural state highway. And so again, if in your community you already had something like this, we would make sure to point that out. That way the participants were able to relate to the information. So again, here we show you an image of what the paved shoulder would look like, how it would interact with the surrounding area. And then when we get into that unique users situation here with the Amish buggies again, I've already talked about this a little bit, but we would talk about the specific needs of those users. And so in this case, they need a wider expanse of pavement to use, and there needs to be additional signage and education because not everyone is familiar with interacting with Amish buggies. So in this case, this is a multi-use path that actually is meant to be used in tandem with Amish buggies, so that's an interesting situation. So then we'll also talk about opportunities. So we've talked about, all of the concerns and constraints, but what are those specific opportunities that your community might have that others don't? And so, there are opportunities for traffic calming, there are opportunities to connect to U.S. and state bike routes, there are opportunities to connect to different schools, to make your main streets more multimodal, to utilize bridges and to make them safer for pedestrians and cyclists, and then to provide access to public lands and recreational areas that might be unique to your community as opposed to a more developed or urban area. So then we talk about public engagement. So at this point, we've assessed the existing conditions. What is active transportation looking like in my community? Where are there gaps in the network? Where are there people or different trip generators that exist where we might want to provide active transportation infrastructure and programming? And now we need to talk about, how do we actually engage the public to inform us on what is important to them, and what are the particularities in a rural community versus a more densely developed or connected community. So first we'll talk about surveys. And so, we'll talk about general things, which you always want to keep in mind with surveying, such as keeping them short and concise, different methodologies, not necessarily statistically significant surveys here, but ways to make sure that you're getting the opinions of the people that are going to use these facilities. And then we also talk about some particularities for rural communities. So things like, you're not necessarily going to put a flyer up on a message board in a coffee shop because probably most people in the community aren't going to be going there because it's not as highly visited. But using things like direct mailings and utility bills, that's going to access people. But what if there isn't water service? Then we have to think about using the electrical bill. And so different things that might seem like common knowledge, but when you're in a flurry trying to put together your active transportation plan and trying to get projects on the ground, these things might slip through the cracks. So public meetings, again, we want to talk about in general, what the best practices are in hosting public meetings, but then we talk a little bit about the specifics in rural communities. What are the different constraints? And so again, we'll take a look at your community in general as we're preparing these materials. But if you have, for example, a very active farming community, then we want to take a look at the time of the year that we're hosting these meetings and the time of day. That way we're not excluding people who are in the agricultural profession even though we're not meaning to. So stakeholder identification, we'll talk about, how do we know who to invite? How do we know who to engage in these conversations? And just above and beyond the residents in our community, we also want to think about who to involve in a more detailed level as well. So who do we want to have on different stakeholder committees to help guide us in our efforts? Who do we want to talk to on a more regular basis and in a more detailed way? And so we'll take a look at all of these different categories of people, but then again, in particular for your community. That way, when you're finished with this training, you understand who it is you might want to go and start talking to initially. So then, last but not least, the most important part of all of this that we're building up to is developing your plan for active transportation in your community. And so we'll take a look at all of these bullet points here, everything from, what is the boundary for your plan to how are we developing the actual plan itself and the recommendations, and then how are we actually implementing it. So as important with any kind of planning effort, we would include this. It's not specific to a rural community, but we need to include it, is thinking about what is the actual boundary of your project. And so talking about, is the entire community of a political jurisdiction? Is it working with several different townships? Is it working with the entire county? But making sure that we're being very specific about what that jurisdiction is. That way we understand the scope of the data that we need to collect, the breadth of the public outreach that we need to do, and any kind of particularities that might exist with the community's politics. So if it's within the community, that's probably a little bit easier than working with adjacent communities. Then we go into the actual development process. So looking at all of these different steps, everything from stakeholder and public engagement to inventorying the existing conditions and determining the future demands for active transportation. And we've already gone through that earlier on in the training. So at this point, it's going to feel, we hope it's going to feel like you've already started some of this process and understand how it fits into the full development process. And then some of the new things that we'd be talking about at this point in the training would be identifying different time frames for the needs. So the short, the medium, and the long term, actually analyzing and identifying different improvements to your transportation network to accommodate bicyclists and pedestrians and other non-motorized users. And then talking about how to integrate those improvements into your different planning processes. We'll talk about estimating the cost of these projects, and then once we know what the cost is, where do we look for funding, and what are the particular funding sources in Ohio and in your area that would be relevant to this. So with the developing recommendations, as I had mentioned, we've already talked about what your current conditions are with your active transportation infrastructure and the socioeconomics of your community. And so then we've also identified where some of those gaps are when we looked at the different data on the map in the first activity. And then we've talked about in different discussion elements in the prior sections of the training who the potential and the current users are, the people that want to walk and bike, or the people that need to walk and bike. And so again, it's all been building up as we've worked through the training. And so then we start talking about implementation and how to actually create active transportation networks. So looking at the different types of the roadway hierarchy and what might be appropriate on the different street types as a way to tier the implementation strategy, if you will. So we provide some guidance on what the best practices by facility type are. And so here's an example of how we would demonstrate that information, but we'll be taking a look at, what are the local roads in your community versus what are the highways in your community. And again, we would pull up a map for your community and be able to take a look and say, okay, if we're talking about a local road in your community, here are the different types of facilities that might be most appropriate. Do you agree? If you don't agree, let's talk about why and look at those specific bits of data from your community that might lend to a different type of facility type. So then we'll do another activity. And so what we would do here is we would take an actual blank, it's kind of like a cartoony map of a road in your town, and you would identify, which road in your town is this, maybe one of the ones we've talked about earlier. And we would actually, go through and talk about what challenges that particular street faces with regard to active transportation. We would talk about what the trip generators are along that corridor, and so again, this would build off of those other activities we've done. And then there are all these little pieces and parts that are things like crosswalks and bike paths and paved shoulders, and you name it, all of the different types of facilities that we've discussed throughout the training. And you would design changes to the roadway in order to address those active transportation needs. If people get really into this activity, it's actually really similar to the activity we do in the traffic calming course, where we have matchbox cars, and you wouldn't believe the amount of conversation that is instigated by this. So I hope you look forward to that. Last but not least, talking about funding resources. And so something that we aim to do in these trainings is to give you a taste of the funding resources that we know offhand would be applicable to your community. But after the fact, we always follow up with an email to all of the participants, and we're able to then include in there any specific funding sources or other resources that have been brought up in the course, or if you have questions during the training, we're able then to follow up afterwards with some more specific responses. So we take a look at all these different funding source types, and then we hone it down into some of the ones that are more specific. And so this is a chart that people tend to find very helpful, and I think have pinned it up on their bulletin board in their offices so they can refer to it otherwise. But looking at, what's the project type in your community, what are the different funding sources. And then we take a look at some online resources for different funding, and we're able to click through some of these that participants in the course are interested in knowing more about. But again, when we send out the follow-up email, there's a copy of the presentation included in there, and so you're then able to go through and actually click on all of the links yourselves. Again, we go through not just funding resources and tools, but other ones that would be pertinent to rural active transportation planning and implementation. And so here's a short list of online resources that you and your counterparts might want to follow up on after the training. And then again, we are able to follow up afterwards too with additional resources based on any kind of questions or requests you have during the training. So then the last activity is talking about what I just mentioned is, what resources do you actually need in your specific community to help you plan and implement for active transportation? So this is just meant to be more of a directed conversation with you and your colleagues and potential partners to identify what types of resources you already have that you're aware of versus what is it that you don't have capacity for. So is it that you need more information on technical assistance programs, either through ODOT or otherwise, to help you with the actual planning and engineering of this kind of project? Do you need actual money? What are the funding sources that might be needed for you? And then other things like we don't even have someone on staff that can do any of this work. How do we go about trying to hire someone and integrate that into our community's operations? And so we can talk about that kind of stuff too. So without further ado, again, if you bring this training to your town, we're going to spend 4 hours going through this. And so for the past 35 minutes, I've been talking to you in a very, very high level about what would be covered during the course. But again, know that it'll be customized to your specific community, and we'll work with you leading up to the training to ensure that you have everything you need in order to invite participants to come. We ask that you have 15 people registered to participate, and if you feel like you aren't able to get 15 people to come on your own, that's where we're happy to come in and help reach out to adjacent communities and our contacts in your area to try to get more people to come and be involved. We will provide follow-up to the training as well. So again, like I had mentioned, we're going to give you a copy of the presentation materials. We're going to give every participant a certificate showing that they completed the course. And then we're going to be able to follow up with you on any additional resources and questions that you may have had during the training or afterwards. You might be wondering, how do I apply for a course? So what you can do is, when this is sent out by Victoria, you can either click on this link here, or as I said before, if you Google and go to ODOT LTAP, Active Transportation Academy, there are links in there for you to sign up, and it's a very brief form, and all we ask for you to do is let us know some potential dates that you'd like to host the training, and if you're approved to host the training, one of us will follow up with you and hash out the details of the actual date and time and any preparatory actions that need to happen ahead of time. We really aim to make this as simple as possible for you. So even though we might be asking you for help with collecting some of the information to include in the presentation, it's really going to be negligible, the amount of time that you spend on it. So thank you very much. We hope that you are interested in hosting this training in your community, and I really look forward to seeing how the presentation materials are going to be customized for each of you, and then over time see how it differs from one rural community to the next. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Victoria.
Thank you, Amelia. While you were speaking, we did have a question in the chat pod about a course flyer, and I did provide a link to that already in the chat pod, but I'll be sending that out to everyone afterwards as well. And there was a question about an RTPO being able to host on behalf of their members. Absolutely. We would love to have every single RTPO in Ohio host this course because, as Amelia explained, it's very, very relevant to the rural areas. It's exactly what is needed to address the issue of active transportation that's out there. As Amelia was talking about trip generators and things being much farther away than, from your home when you're living in the rural area. It just made me think about my weekends where I have to plan my trips to get everything at once, because when I have to go to the grocery store, it's 30 minutes one way to go to the grocery store from my house, and that's in my car. So there's no way I'm planning to walk there. But, if we can help promote more of an active transportation lifestyle in the rural areas, and definitely, looking at our populations that are already doing that, such as the Amish community, that would be wonderful. So I think you did a great job with the course overview, and I'm really excited. I hope a lot of people sign up to have this course hosted in their communities. So we didn't have any other questions come in the chat pod. I'll give you a second more to put one in if you've got one. If not, as I said at the beginning, we did attempt to record the webinar, so if that's successful, I'll definitely be sending a link out to it along with a copy of the PowerPoint and also a link to the flyer for this course and all the others that we offer through the Active Transportation Academy. So Amelia, no other questions came in the chat pod. You're off the hook. So thank you so much for your time this morning. And thank you all for joining us. We appreciated having you on the webinar, and we hope to see you on a future webinar. Take care.